The Vorkan Empire had conquered 47 star systems in less than a decade, and their military commanders believed nothing could stop them now because they had the biggest ships and the strongest weapons in the galaxy. And when their scout vessels detected the human civilization near the edge of the Orion Spur, they saw only another weak species ready to be conquered and enslaved like all the others before them, and Commander Zekthar reviewed the intelligence reports about humans with a satisfied expression on his scaled face because the data showed that humans had only recently achieved faster than light travel, and their ships looked crude and primitive compared to Vorkan technology, and their weapons seemed almost laughable in comparison to the plasma cannons and antimatter torpedoes that the Vorkan fleet carried into every battle, and the war would be over quickly, perhaps in just a few days or maybe a week at most, and then human space would belong to the Empire, just like all the other territories they had claimed, and the humans would serve as workers in Vorkan mines and factories until they were no longer useful. On Earth, Admiral Richard Hayes stood in the command center of the United Earth Defense Force headquarters and watched the sensor displays with a calm expression that hid his racing thoughts, because 300 Vorkan warships had just entered human space, and they were moving in perfect military formation toward the outer colonies where human families lived and worked and raised their children. And he knew that those colonists had very little time before the alien fleet arrived at their doorstep. And he turned to his second-in-command and told Captain Lisa Morgan to contact President Collins immediately and to activate Protocol Omega, which was the emergency defense plan that humanity had been developing in secret for the past 5 years, ever since they first detected hostile alien signals in deep space. And Captain Morgan hesitated for just a moment, because Protocol Omega had never been tested in actual combat conditions, and nobody knew for certain if it would work against a real enemy fleet. But Admiral Hayes simply looked at her with steady eyes and said that they were about to find out, and that the Vorkan aliens were about to learn why humans had survived every threat their homeworld had thrown at them for millions of years. The outer colony of New Montana received the alert with only 17 minutes of warning before the Vorkan fleet would arrive in orbit, and 17 minutes was not much time to evacuate thousands of colonists, but it was enough time to execute the emergency plan that every colony had practiced dozens of times. And Governor Paul Jenkins watched from his command post as colonists rushed to the underground shelters that had been built beneath every settlement, and by the time the Vorkan ships appeared in the sky above New Montana, the streets were empty, and the buildings looked abandoned, and the defense systems were completely silent, as if the humans had simply run away in terror, and the Vorkan forces saw this as confirmation of what they already believed, that humans were cowards who would flee rather than fight. The Vorkan soldiers landed on the surface without meeting any resistance, and they spread through the empty streets of the colony settlement, and they searched the buildings and found them empty, and their commander reported back to the fleet in orbit that the humans had abandoned the colony completely. And High Marshal Vorgath, who commanded the invasion fleet from his flagship, smiled with satisfaction, because this meant the conquest would be even easier than predicted, and he ordered more troops to land and secure the entire planet. But what the Vorkans did not know was that humans had been preparing for exactly this scenario ever since they realized they were not alone in a friendly universe, and every human colony and every space station and every military installation had been built with one guiding principle in mind, which was to never fight the war that the enemy expected. Governor Jenkins waited until the Vorkan forces had spread themselves thin across the colony surface, and then he activated the command code that would begin Operation Thunderstrike, and immediately the ground beneath the Vorkan soldiers erupted, with swarms of microscopic drones that were each no larger than a grain of sand, but were programmed with sophisticated artificial intelligence that gave them one simple mission, which was to find every Vorkan soldier and infiltrate their armor and weapons and communication systems and disable everything. And the tiny drones poured into every crack and seam in the Vorkan battlesuits and into every ventilation port and sensor array, and within just a few minutes, 3,000 Vorkan warriors found themselves unable to see or hear or move or fire their weapons because the drones had shut down every system in their armor, and they stood like statues in the ghost town, unable to do anything except wait for whatever would come next. Commander Zekthar watched in growing horror from his ship in orbit as his entire ground force simply stopped responding to commands, and he tried to contact them on every frequency, but received only silence, and he ordered his tactical officer to scan for weapons or energy signatures that might explain what happened, but the scans showed nothing unusual. And then he tried to activate the orbital bombardment systems to destroy whatever was attacking his troops, but the weapons refused to fire, and warning lights began flashing across every console on the bridge. And his tactical officer shouted that something had invaded their computer systems and was spreading through the entire ship like a virus, and within seconds the main power failed and emergency lights came on. But it was already too late because the virus had infected not just his flagship, but 80% of the entire Vorkon invasion fleet. Admiral Hayes stood calmly in the command center and watched as the Vorkon ships drifted helplessly in orbit around New Montana. And he allowed himself a small smile before turning to Captain Morgan and telling her to open a communication channel on all frequencies because he wanted every ship in that fleet to hear what he had to say. And when the channel was open, he spoke in a calm and measured voice that somehow made his words more frightening than any shouted threat. And he said that this was Admiral Richard Hayes of the United Earth Defense Force, and that the Vorkon invasion had failed completely, and that their ships were now under human control, and that humanity could destroy the entire fleet with a single command but would choose not to do so because humans were not mindless killers, and instead the Vorkons would be allowed to return home with minimal power restored to their engines, but only after they delivered a very important message to their leaders. He paused for a moment to let his words sink in across 300 ships full of terrified Vorkon warriors, and then he continued speaking and said that human space was not theirs to take, and that humanity had not come to the stars looking for war. But if other species brought war to them, then those species would discover that humans had been perfecting the art of warfare since before the Vorkons even had written language, and that humans did not just defend themselves when attacked, but instead turned enemy weapons against them and made enemy strengths into weaknesses, and won battles before the first shot was ever fired. And he told them to go home and tell their empire what had happened here, and to warn them that this was only the beginning of what humans could do if pushed into a corner. 6 weeks passed after the failed invasion of New Montana, and the Vorkon Empire gathered its forces again because the humiliation of their defeat burned like fire in the hearts of their military leaders. And High Marshal Vorgath stood before the War Council and slammed his scaled fists on the black stone table and declared that this shame could not be allowed to stand, and that the humans had made fools of them with cheap tricks and caught them by surprise. But it would never happen again, because now they knew what to expect and they would be ready for anything the humans tried. The Vorkon scientists worked day and night to analyze the human nano-drones and the cyber weapons that had defeated their first invasion, and they developed countermeasures including electromagnetic shielding that would block the tiny drones and closed network systems that would prevent any virus from spreading between ships and redundant backup protocols that would keep ships operational even if primary systems failed, and the military leaders believed these defenses would be enough to protect them from human trickery, and they began assembling an even larger fleet with over 800 warships, because they reasoned that overwhelming numbers would guarantee victory even if some of their new defenses failed to work as planned. What the Vorkons did not know was that every ship they had sent home from the first battle had been secretly compromised with hidden programs that quietly observed and recorded everything, and transmitted the data back to human space through quantum communications that were impossible to detect with normal sensors. And in a converted mining asteroid that humans called Echo Base, Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison sat at his console and watched intelligence reports streaming in from deep inside Vorkon territory, and he saw every ship movement and every strategic discussion and every plan the Vorkons made. And he shook his head slowly because the Vorkons were making the same mistake again by assuming they understood how humans fought. Corporal Amy Walsh, who worked as an intelligence analyst, sat next to Jake and stared at the data with wide eyes, because she could not believe they had access to such detailed information about enemy operations, and she said it was incredible that they could read Vorkon communications in real time. But Jake reminded her to never assume the enemy was stupid, just because they were arrogant, and he pulled up a tactical display showing the Vorkon fleet massing near their forward staging area, and he could see they were preparing an invasion force 3 times larger than before, and he immediately sent the intelligence report to Admiral Hayes on Earth, because humanity needed to prepare for the coming storm. President Samantha Collins convened an emergency meeting of the Security Council, and Admiral Hayes stood before the assembled leaders and explained that the Vorkon fleet would enter human space in 72 hours, and that the enemy had hardened their systems against cyber attacks and deployed countermeasures against the nanodrone swarms that had worked so well in the first battle. And Secretary of Defense Martin Webb asked what the plan was, because humanity could not fight 800 warships with conventional weapons and would be overwhelmed within hours. And Admiral Hayes smiled with an expression that made several people in the room feel uneasy, because it was the smile of someone who knew something dangerous. He activated a holographic display and explained that humanity would not fight the Vorkans conventionally, but would instead make them fight against ghosts and shadows, and he revealed that Project Ghost Ship was now operational with 50 of the fastest human frigates equipped with experimental cloaking technology that made them invisible to sensors and even to the naked eye. And the technology had been reverse-engineered from alien scout drones that Earth forces had captured 3 years earlier, and Dr. Helen Carter and her team had managed to make it work just in time, and now human ships could slip through enemy defenses like they did not exist at all. Captain Morgan added that humanity had also deployed thousands of Echo Boys throughout the outer star systems, and these devices projected false sensor signatures that could make one human ship look like 10 ships, or make an empty sector of space look like it was filled with armed defense stations, and the Vorkans would not be able to tell what was real and what was illusion until it was far too late to matter. And President Collins listened to the plan and approved it because there were no other options available, and humanity would either succeed with this strategy or face extinction. The Vorkan Armada jumped into the frontier system where the human colony of New Arizona waited, and immediately their sensors detected dozens of human ships and hundreds of defense platforms and fighter squadrons, and it appeared that the humans had gathered their entire fleet to make a final stand, and High Marshal Vorgath smiled because this meant he could destroy all human military forces in one decisive battle, and he ordered his ships to advance and engage the enemy and the Vorkan. Fleet surged forward with weapons charging and shields at maximum power, and they opened fire on the nearest human vessels with plasma cannons that could melt through starship armor. But their shots passed through empty space and hit nothing at all, and the Vorkan gunners checked their targeting systems because surely they had not missed at such close range. But the computer confirmed the targets were exactly where they appeared to be. And Commander Zekthar, who had survived the first invasion, realized with growing horror that they were firing at holographic projections and not real ships. And he reported to High Marshal Vorgath that the human vessels were not actually there and were nothing but ghosts made of light, and before the Vorkans could adjust their tactics, the real attack began. From positions the Vorkans could not detect, 50 ghost ships decloaked for just a few seconds at a time, and fired precision strikes at Vorkan engines and weapon systems, and then vanished again before return fire could be targeted, and the attacks seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, and Vorkan ships began losing power and weapons as the invisible human vessels struck again and again like sharks circling in dark water, and High Marshal Vorgath screamed orders to return fire. But his gunners could not lock onto targets that disappeared as soon as they appeared, and in their panic the Vorkan fleet began firing blindly into empty space, and several ships accidentally hit their own allies in the confusion. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison watched the battle from Echo Base with fierce satisfaction, because the Vorkan fleet was panicking and breaking formation and wasting ammunition shooting at shadows, and he told Amy that this was what happened when you took away an enemy's ability to see the battlefield clearly, and she reported that Vorkan shield generators were draining rapidly, because the constant maneuvering and blind firing was exhausting their power reserves. And Jake nodded and said it was time to move to Phase 2 of the operation. Commander Nathan Drake piloted the ghost ship Phantom Blade through the chaotic battle and coordinated hit-and-run attacks with deadly efficiency because his crew had trained for months in this new style of warfare where speed and stealth mattered more than armor and firepower, and his weapons officer Lieutenant Foster reported 47 confirmed hits on Vorkan engines, which meant 47 enemy ships were now drifting helplessly and unable to maneuver. And Nathan praised his crew, but warned them not to get overconfident because the Vorkans would adapt eventually. As if responding to his warning, the Vorkan formation suddenly changed, and instead of spreading out to chase ghosts, they pulled into a tight defensive sphere, with ships overlapping their shields to create a unified barrier, and Nathan recognized this as a clever tactical adjustment because the compressed formation gave human ships fewer angles of attack, and he transmitted a message to Echo Base requesting new orders because the hit-and-run strategy was no longer as effective. Admiral Hayes received the tactical update and immediately understood the problem, and he told Captain Morgan to activate Project Minefield, because it was time to spring the trap that humanity had been preparing for 6 weeks, and the entire frontier. System had been seeded with thousands of smart mines that had been drifting in stealth mode and multiplying and spreading, and waiting for exactly this moment. And now, with the Vorkan fleet deep in the kill zone, the mines activated all at once and swarmed the enemy ships like angry insects. And each mine was equipped with adaptive targeting that could identify weak points in Vorkan shields and armor, and each carried a shaped plasma charge designed specifically to punch through Vorkan defenses. The defensive sphere that had protected the Vorkan fleet from ghost ship attacks now became a death trap, because the ships were packed so closely together that when one vessel's shields failed, the smart mines could attack multiple targets at once, and explosions rippled through the formation like fire spreading through dry grass, and ships careened out of control with their engines destroyed, and some tried to break away from the formation only to find more mines waiting in every direction. And High Marshal Vorgath watched in absolute horror as his mighty armada began to die around him, and he finally understood that the humans had turned the entire star system into a weapon. Commander Zekthar whispered that they had not invaded human space at all, but had flown directly into a carefully prepared killing field, and that every moment they remained here meant more ships would be lost. And High Marshal Vorgath finally gave the order that he never thought he would have to give, and commanded the entire fleet to retreat immediately and make emergency jumps to hyperspace and escape while they still could. But jumping to hyperspace required precise calculations and stable engine power, and the smart mines had specifically targeted the jump drives of every ship they attacked, and of the 847 warships that had entered the system, only 312 managed to make the jump to safety, and the rest were left drifting in space, completely crippled and helpless and at the mercy of the humans they had come to conquer. Admiral Hayes opened a communication channel to the fleeing Vorkan ships, and his voice was calm and steady as he delivered another message that would echo across the galaxy, and he said that the Vorkans had come back just as he predicted they would, and that he was not surprised because he understood that pride and arrogance were powerful forces. But he wanted them to understand something very important about humanity, and about what would happen if they continued this war. And he explained that every time the Vorkans attacked, humans learned more about them, and every time the Vorkans adapted their tactics, humans adapted faster, because humanity had been perfecting warfare for 10,000 years, and had fought themselves in every way imaginable, and had brought all that terrible experience to the stars with them. He paused to let his words sink in across the surviving Vorkan ships, and then continued by saying that this was the second lesson the Vorkans had learned, and that the first lesson was that humans could turn Vorkan technology against them, and the second lesson was that humans could turn entire star systems into weapons, and he warned them that if they came back for a third time, they would receive a third lesson, and that lesson would involve humans stopping their defensive posture and bringing the fight directly to Vorkan space. And he promised that the Vorkans did not want to see what humans were capable of when they went on the offensive, because the weapons humanity had used so far were nothing compared to what they could deploy if truly threatened with extinction. Captain Morgan asked Admiral Hayes if they should finish off the crippled Vorkan ships while they had the chance. But Hayes shook his head and said no, because letting them live and return home was more valuable than destroying them. And he explained that fear was a weapon too, and right now humanity wanted the Vorkan Empire to be very afraid of what humans could do if provoked further, and the crippled ships would serve as a reminder of that fear and would make the Vorkan leaders think very carefully before attacking again. 3 months after the destruction of their grand fleet, the Vorkan Empire was a changed place, and the War Council chamber was silent as High Marshal Vorgath stood before the assembled leaders with his head bowed in shame, because he had now led 2 failed invasions against the humans and lost over 1,000 ships and 30,000 warriors. And worst of all, the reputation of Vorkan military might had been shattered across the galaxy, and Supreme Overlord Zarthan, who was the eldest and most powerful of all Vorkan leaders, looked at Vorgath with cold ancient eyes and asked why he should not be executed for his failures. Vorgath kept his head low and explained that the humans were not like any species the Vorkans had ever encountered before, and that they did not fight with honor in open battle but used deception and trickery and traps, and turned Vorkan strengths into weaknesses, and General Thakmor interrupted and said that this proved humans were cowards who hid because they could not face Vorkan warriors in true combat. But the strategist Krell stepped forward and disagreed, and said that humans were not cowards at all, but were pragmatists who fought to win rather than to satisfy honor codes. Krell activated a holographic display showing Earth's bloody history, and explained that humans had been at war with themselves for their entire existence as a species, and had refined warfare to an art form that the Vorkans could not comprehend. Because while the Vorkan Empire had conquered through superior numbers and technology, humans had conquered each other through constant innovation and adaptation, and every century they revolutionized how wars were fought, and they did not see warfare as a test of strength but as a problem to be solved with intelligence and creativity. Supreme Overlord Zarthan listened carefully and asked if Krell believed this made humans truly dangerous, and Krell replied bluntly that it made them nearly impossible to defeat using conventional military methods, because every attack the Vorkans launched gave humans more data and more captured technology and more opportunities to learn and adapt. And essentially the Vorkan Empire was teaching humans exactly how to kill Vorkans more efficiently. And Zarthan was silent for a long moment before making his decision, and he declared that the Vorkans would not teach the humans anything more, but would instead crush them with such overwhelming force that humans would have no time to adapt or learn. He ordered the assembly of every available warship and every warrior who could hold a weapon, because the Vorkans would not strike at the edges of human territory anymore, but would drive straight to Earth itself and burn the human homeworld to ashes before they could deploy any more tricks or traps. And Krell showed doubt in his expression, but bowed his head, and accepted the orders because arguing with the Supreme Overlord was not wise. And the preparations began immediately for the largest military operation in Vorkan history. Human intelligence analysts detected the massive Vorkan military buildup within just a few days, because the quantum communication devices hidden in Vorkan ships continued to transmit data back to human space, and President Collins called an emergency meeting when she learned that the Vorkans were mobilizing not hundreds but thousands of ships, and the holographic display in the Situation Room showed 3,000 warships and 40 million soldiers assembling for an invasion, and it was enough firepower to sterilize every human colony twice over. And Secretary of Defense Webb looked pale and asked if humanity could possibly stop such a massive force. Admiral Hayes stated flatly that they could not stop the Vorkans with conventional forces or with the tricks and traps they had used before, because the enemy would be expecting those tactics now, and the Vorkan fleet would drive straight for Earth and bet that humans would either panic or surrender or die trying to defend their homeworld. But President Collins asked what humanity would actually do, and Hayes met her eyes steadily and said they would defend Earth, but not in the way the Vorkans expected. And he opened a secure channel and spoke directly to Dr. Helen Carter and told her it was time to activate Project Ragnarok. In the secret facility buried deep in the Rocky Mountains, Dr. Carter looked at her team with an expression that mixed pride and terror, because Project Ragnarok had been purely theoretical until 3 weeks ago, and it was dangerous and unpredictable, and possibly catastrophic even for humanity itself. But faced with the extinction of their entire species, theoretical had become necessary, and her assistant Danny Price asked with trembling hands if they were really sure about this decision, and Helen replied honestly that no, they were not sure at all. But if they did not try, then there would be no human species left to regret the decision, and she gave the order to activate the network of devices that had been hidden throughout human space. Across human space, in locations hidden deep in asteroid belts and buried on distant moons and concealed in planetary rings, thousands of devices came online simultaneously, and each one began drawing massive amounts of power from nearby stars, using advanced solar collection arrays, and each device began to hum with barely contained energy. And they were weapons unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, because they were not designed to fire projectiles or beams of energy, but instead were designed to weaponize the fundamental forces of reality itself. And Commander Nathan Drake received the classified briefing about Project Ragnarok aboard his ghost ship, and felt his blood run cold as he read the technical specifications. Ensign Kelly Brooks read over his shoulder and asked what exactly the devices were supposed to do, and Nathan replied quietly that they were going to weaponize gravity itself and create artificial gravity wells strong enough to rip starships apart and turn physics into a weapon. And Lieutenant Foster looked skeptical and said that should be impossible because the energy requirements would be astronomical. But Nathan explained that humans were powering the devices directly from stars and that the scientists believed it would work with about 60% probability. And Kelly asked what would happen in the other 40% of outcomes. And Nathan did not answer because they all understood that the other 40% involved accidentally creating black holes or tearing holes in space-time, or possibly collapsing Earth's sun, and these were minor risks compared to the guaranteed extinction that would come if the Vorkan Armada succeeded. The orders came through that ghost ships were to lead the Vorkan fleet into position by acting as bait, and once the enemy was deep enough into the kill zone, humanity would activate Project Ragnarok and hope that they did not accidentally destroy the solar system in the process. And Kelly muttered that it was just another normal day in the United Earth Defense Force, and the ghost ship crews prepared themselves for what might be their final mission. The Vorkan Grand Fleet entered human space like a tsunami of metal and fire, and 3,000 warships moved in perfect formation, with their shields overlapping and their sensors scanning on all frequencies, because they had learned from their previous defeats, and this time they would advance slowly and methodically and sweep every cubic meter of space for hidden threats. And High Marshal Vorgath commanded from his rebuilt flagship with Supreme Overlord Zarthan, observing from the secondary bridge because the Supreme Overlord wanted to personally witness the final victory over humanity, and his presence reminded everyone that failure would mean death for all the senior commanders. The sensor operator reported detecting 20 human ships near the fourth planet, and they appeared to be destroyer-class vessels holding a defensive position. And General Thakmore laughed and said the humans dared to challenge 3,000 warships, with only 20 ships, and that they must have gone completely insane. But Vorgath cautioned his officers to remember the lessons they had learned, and warned that nothing with humans was ever as simple as it seemed. And Zarthan declared that even if it was a trap, they would spring it and crush whatever the humans had prepared because 3,000 ships could overwhelm any defense through sheer numbers alone. The human destroyers held their position until the Vorkan fleet came within weapons range, and then they turned and fled deeper into the solar system toward Earth, and the Vorkan Armada pursued while maintaining their tight formation and keeping sensors alert for mines or hidden weapons or any other tricks the humans might deploy. And Admiral Hayes watched from Earth's orbital command center as the Vorkan fleet moved closer, and everything now depended on precise timing, because if they activated Ragnarok too early, the Vorkans might escape, and if they waited too late, the enemy fleet would reach Earth before the weapon could stop them. Captain Morgan reported that the ghost ships were in position, and that the Vorkan fleet would enter the activation zone in 90 seconds, and Admiral Hayes took a deep breath, because this was humanity's final gamble and their last chance to survive. And he contacted Dr. Carter and asked for the status of Project Ragnarok. And Helen's voice came through the communication system tight with tension, and she said the devices were fully charged and synchronized and ready to activate on his command. But she needed to warn him one final time that their models predicted a 12% chance of catastrophic side effects, including spatial fractures and gravitational anomalies, and possible tears in the fabric of space-time itself. Hayes replied gently that he understood the risks, but humanity was completely out of options, and if they did not try this, then there was a 100% chance of human extinction, and those odds were far worse than 12%. And Captain Morgan announced 60 seconds until the Vorkan fleet reached the optimal position, and on the Vorkan flagship alarm suddenly began screaming, and the sensor operator shouted that he was detecting massive energy buildups throughout the inner solar system, and unknown power signatures were appearing everywhere. And Vorgath felt his blood freeze because he recognized this as another trap, and he screamed orders for the fleet to reverse course immediately and retreat. But 3,000 ships could not change direction in just seconds because momentum and tight formation kept them moving forward straight into the kill zone. Admiral Hayes gave the command to activate Project Ragnarok, and across the solar system, thousands of gravity generators pulsed in perfect synchronization, and the effect was immediate and absolutely catastrophic, and space itself seemed to twist and bend in ways that violated every natural law, and the Vorkan fleet found itself caught in artificial gravity wells that were orders of magnitude stronger than anything produced by planets or stars, and ships that had withstood plasma fire and Missile strikes began to crumple like paper cups as impossible tidal forces pulled them in different directions simultaneously, and hulls buckled and shields collapsed under stress they were never designed to handle, and warriors inside the ships screamed as artificial gravity went haywire, and some were crushed against bulkheads while others were lifted up and smashed against ceilings. The perfect military formation disintegrated within seconds, and ships collided with each other because their navigation systems could not compensate for the chaotic gravity fields, and some vessels were literally pulled apart by competing gravity wells that tugged them in opposite directions, and others imploded as local gravity spikes created forces strong enough to compress metal and flesh into impossibly small spaces. And in just 60 seconds, the most powerful military fleet in Vorkon history was reduced to floating wreckage and debris. Supreme Overlord Zarthan clutched his command throne as the flagship groaned and twisted around him, and he whispered that it was impossible, because no species should have the power to weaponize gravity itself, and that this was the power of gods, not mortals. And Vorgath worked frantically at the controls trying to stabilize the ship and shouted that they must retreat immediately. But the main reactor breach alarm began screaming, and then everything disappeared in a flash of white light as the flagship's power core exploded. The ghost ships watched from a safe distance as the Vorkan Grand Fleet died, and it was not a glorious battle, but a massacre by invisible forces as reality itself was turned against them. And Kelly breathed that they had actually done it, and they had won. But Nathan's face remained grim, and he said yes, they had won, but they had also revealed a level of power that was terrifying even to humans themselves, and that humanity needed to be very careful not to become the monsters in their own story. Admiral Hayes broadcast one final message on all frequencies to ensure that every surviving Vorkan and every other alien species monitoring the conflict would hear his words clearly, and he identified himself and addressed the Vorkan Empire and any other power that might be considering aggression against humanity. And he told them that what they just witnessed was not humanity's full capability, but only a warning, and that humans could weaponize gravity, and could make stars explode, and could fold space, and could do things that should be impossible according to normal physics. He paused and then continued by saying that humans did not want to use these terrible weapons because they had come to the stars seeking peace and knowledge and cooperation, but the Vorkans had forced them to become weapons, and the terrifying truth was that humans were better at warfare than any species could imagine, because they had been fighting wars since before they had written language, and they knew 1,000 ways to kill, and they had barely shown 10 of those ways so far, and this was humanity's final warning to leave them alone and let them live in peace, because if anyone forced them to fight again, humans would not stop at defense but would bring the war to enemy worlds using weapons that alien scientists had not even dreamed of yet. 2 years passed after the Vorkan War ended, and the galaxy had become a very different place because news of humanity's victory had spread through every trade route and every diplomatic channel and every alien civilization with the technology to receive signals, and the species that had been dismissed as primitive newcomers had revealed themselves to be something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined, and on the neutral station called Kepler Prime, representatives from 100 different species gathered for what everyone was calling the Summit of Reconciliation, though most understood it was really a conference about how to avoid being destroyed by humans. Gregory Stone, who had somehow become Earth's official trade ambassador, despite never asking for the job, found himself at the center of galactic attention, and council mediator Zixthar, who was a tall crystalline being, spoke for the assembled civilizations, and explained that the Vorkan Empire had formally sued for peace, and wished to negotiate terms of surrender, and would offer reparations and demilitarization and anything else humanity requested. But Gregory interrupted and said no with such finality that the entire chamber fell into stunned silence. Zixthar's crystalline body made a confused chiming sound, and asked what Gregory meant by refusing the Vorkan surrender, because by every standard of galactic law, humanity had the right to demand whatever terms they wished, including territorial concessions and tribute payments, and even subjugation of the Vorkan species if they chose. And a reptilian ambassador from the Krelix Assembly added that humanity had destroyed 3,000 Vorkan ships and killed their supreme overlord and decimated their military and earned the right to claim victory in any way they desired. Gregory sipped his coffee calmly and explained that humans were not interested in any of those things because humanity had not fought the war because they wanted to conquer the Vorkans, but had fought only because the Vorkans would not leave them alone, and now humans just wanted to get back to exploring and trading and learning about the galaxy. But he added in a much harder voice that if anyone attacked them again, whether Vorkan or any other species, humanity would not stop at destroying fleets but would get creative. And he promised that nobody wanted to see what humans could do when they really got creative with warfare. On Earth, President Collins met privately with Admiral Hayes and Dr. Carter in the Oval Office, and the conversation was far less diplomatic than the one happening at Kepler Prime. And Collins said that the Vorkans had formally requested peace, but intelligence reports suggested they were already quietly rebuilding their fleet, and Hayes nodded and said that was exactly what he would do in their position, because the Vorkans could not afford to appear weak to their other enemies. But he was confident they would never attack humanity again, because they finally understood what humans truly were. Dr. Carter pulled up intercepted Vorkan communications and played a recording of their new military leadership discussing humanity. And a translated Vorkan voice said that humans were not a young species stumbling into space, but were actually an ancient war species that had finally escaped their planetary cradle, and that every war humans had fought against each other had made them stronger and refined their tactics, and they had come to the stars carrying 10,000 years of accumulated military knowledge, and the Vorkans had thought they were attacking primitives, but had actually attacked the most evolved warfare species in the entire galaxy. President Collins listened with mixed feelings of pride and concern, and asked if being seen as a warfare species was a bad thing. And Hayes considered the question carefully and said it depended entirely on what humanity did next, because fear could maintain peace, but it could also create enemies by default, and humanity needed to show the galaxy they were not just weapons, but were also people with culture and compassion and curiosity about the universe. Far from Earth, on a hospital ship orbiting the ruins of Vorkan military shipyards, human medical teams worked alongside Vorkan doctors to treat wounded warriors from the destroyed fleet, and Lieutenant Commander Marcus Chen, who was a trauma surgeon, found himself operating on a Vorkan soldier whose injuries were severe but survivable, and when the Vorkan regained consciousness, he asked Marcus why humans would save him when his people had tried to exterminate humanity. Marcus cleaned his surgical instruments after 18 straight hours of operations and explained that saving lives was what humans did, because when the fighting stopped, they became healers, and it was part of who they were as a species. And yes, humans could be brutal in war, but they were not monsters, and they did not kill unnecessarily, and they certainly did not let people die when they had the ability to save them. And the Vorkan stared at him with an expression close to wonder and said he did not understand humans at all. Marcus smiled tiredly and said that humans did not always understand themselves either. But the important thing for the Vorkan to know was that humans were capable of both great violence and great compassion, and the trick was not forcing them to choose violence, because if you let humans be healers and explorers, then everyone would get along fine. But if you forced them to be warriors, then the results were exactly what the Vorkans had experienced. News of human medical teams saving Vorkan lives spread almost as quickly as news of their military victories had spread, and Vorkan civilians who had been told that humans were bloodthirsty monsters saw images of human doctors working around the clock to save Vorkan soldiers, and it created confusion and doubt, and eventually a grudging respect, because a species that could weaponize gravity but chose to save enemy lives was more complex than simple propaganda could explain. On Kepler Prime, Gregory met privately with the Vorkan ambassador, who was a scarred warrior named Kethril, who had lost an arm during the Battle of Earth, and Kethril stated bluntly that his empire wanted peace, but also wanted to understand how humans had defeated them so completely when the Vorkans had superior numbers and superior technology and superior experience, and Gregory poured 2 glasses of whiskey and explained honestly that the Vorkans lost because they thought warfare was about strength in numbers, while humans had learned long ago that warfare was really about adaptation and creativity. He slid 1 glass across to Kethril and said it did not matter if your army was twice as large as the enemy's army, if the enemy could make you fight against yourself, and it did not matter if your ships had stronger armor if the enemy could turn the space around those ships into a weapon. And the Vorkans had fought the kind of war they knew and understood, while humans had invented an entirely new kind of war, and that would always result in defeat for the side fighting conventionally. Kethril took a cautious sip of the whiskey, and his eyes widened at the burning sensation, and he said the drink was intense, and Gregory smiled slightly and said it was like humans themselves because they tended to be a bit much for people who expected something milder. And Kethril asked quietly if humanity would seek revenge and invade Vorkan space the way the Vorkans had invaded human space. And Gregory shook his head firmly and said that was not who humans were because they did not want Vorkan territory or resources and just wanted to be left alone to explore and learn. But Gregory added seriously that if the Vorkans attacked again, or if they attacked any species that became allies with humanity, then humans would not just defend themselves, but would make absolutely certain the lesson stuck permanently. And he promised that humanity's follow-up lessons were significantly less pleasant than the initial ones had been. In the Vorkan Empire, former High Marshal Vorgath, who had been stripped of his rank but spared execution, was given one final duty, which was teaching young Vorkan warriors the truth about humanity. And he told his students that they would hear stories claiming humans were invincible, but this was not true because humans could be killed and their ships could be destroyed and their defenses could be breached. But the critical thing to understand was that humans did not fight to win individual battles but fought to win entire wars. He explained that every battle against humans taught them something new, and every defeat made them stronger. And even if you attacked a human position and won the battle, you had still taught them how you fought, and they would learn and adapt, and the next time you faced them, they would have developed a perfect counter to all your tactics. And a young warrior asked how anyone could possibly defeat such an enemy. And Vorgath was silent for a long time before finally answering that you did not defeat humanity, but instead made peace with them and traded with them and learned from them. But you never ever attacked them, because the moment you chose to attack, you had already lost, even if you did not know it yet. The Treaty of New Horizons was signed at the conclusion of the Summit of Reconciliation, and the terms were remarkably simple, because humanity would not seek territorial expansion or revenge against the Vorkan Empire. And in return, the Vorkans and all other signatory species would recognize human space as completely sovereign and inviolable, and any future aggression would be met with the full capability of human military power, and everyone now understood exactly what that phrase meant. As Gregory prepared to return to Earth, Mediator Zixthar approached him privately and asked if he was afraid of what his species had become because humans had revealed capabilities that should not exist and had